In the classic film It's a Wonderful Life, George Bailey spent his life dreaming of escaping the town of Bedford Falls to find adventure, fame, and fortune. In 1955, when Jimmy Bartlett was drafted by the New York Rangers, head coach Phil Watson promised him a spot on the team if he worked hard and showed up in shape at training camp. But the cocky and overconfident Bartlett showed up out of shape at training camp and ended up being the last player cut from the team that year. Assigned to the Rhode Island Reds of the AHL, Jimmy scored 28 goals in 50 games and helped the Reds win the Calder Cup. Although he was determined to make it to the big stage in Manhattan, Jimmy had another crappy training camp the following year and then got sidelined in 1957 due to the Asian flu pandemic. After 3 years playing for the Reds, Jimmy began to feel trapped, much like George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life. But in 1958, Bartlett finally made the Rangers roster, and in 1959 scored the NHL's only natural hat trick against Hall of Fame goaltender Johnny Bower. Jimmy's dream had finally come true. However, in 1961, when Phil Watson, the new head coach of the Boston Bruins, told Jimmy that the team had decided to let him go, but that the Toronto Maple Leafs were interested in acquiring him, Jimmy surprised Phil by expressing his disinterest in playing for Toronto. Instead, he requested to be sold to the Rhode Island Reds. In It's a Wonderful Life, George Bailey eventually learned to appreciate the deep sense of community and belonging that the small town of Bedford Falls offered. He realized that the love and support of family and friends far outweighed the allure of fame and fortune. By the end of the film, George Bailey no longer felt trapped in Bedford Falls. There was no place else he would rather be. While Jimmy was playing with the Reds in the 1950s, nothing mattered more to him than his desire to play for the Rangers. However, during that time, Jimmy slowly acclimated to life in New England. He met and married a local Providence girl and had 2 children with her. Since he was married to an American, he didn't have to return to his family in Canada like the majority of players in the league. Instead, Jim and Helen bought a house in Seekonk, and during the summer off-season, he worked as an iron worker, a union job he was able to have arranged for him through his wife's Italian Uncle Ernie. Bartlett loved to brag about the many times he cheated death. He claimed that one summer, while working on the construction of a bridge, he slipped off a beam, plunging approximately 100 feet into the water below. By some miracle, he splashed down between 2 massive pylons, narrowly escaping certain death. Another time, he narrowly avoided tragedy when a steel box he was working inside collapsed just moments after he crawled out of it. And then he got electrocuted at a job site once, losing consciousness. He didn't appear to be breathing. Everybody thought he was dead, but Bartlett proved once again that he seemed to have been born with a horseshoe up his ass. By staying in Providence year-round and playing softball while working a regular job during the summer, off-season, Bartlett became a member of the local community and won the affections of the Providence fans. By the time Jimmy finally joined the Rangers in 1958, the unique Italian New England culture and people of the city and the sandy beaches of Narragansett had already worked their magic on him. After every game in which Bartlett scored a goal, he would ritualistically light up a big cigar and celebrate with the fans. The people who were fans of the Reds were no longer just fans to Jimmy. They were his neighbors. They were his friends. Jimmy Bartlett had truly become a New Englander. It was now his home. Phil Watson had wrongly assumed that Jimmy would be overjoyed to have the opportunity to play for the Toronto Maple Leafs. But by 1961, Bartlett realized that he would be happiest playing for a city that loved him and that he loved in return, even if it meant earning less money. There was nowhere else he wanted to be, because during his time playing for the Rhode Island Reds in the 1950s, Bartlett had truly experienced a wonderful life. Jimmy loved playing for Rhode Island so much that years after he no longer played for the team, and he no longer even lived in New England, he would get on stage with local bands and bars and lead the crowd with the following sing-along. Hit it, Miss Vivian! At the beginning of the season, the American Hockey League expanded to 8 teams when the Pittsburgh Hornets rejoined the league after dropping out 5 years earlier. Jimmy was happy to play for his new coach, Fernie Flamin, because Fernie was his friend and had been his former teammate just 6 months earlier when they both played for the Boston Bruins. And because Fernie was one of the toughest players in the history of the NHL, Bartlett knew that Fernie would not object to Jimmy's aggressive approach to the game. The Rhode Island Reds team of the '61 season was completely different from the teams that Jimmy had played for in the '50s. The Rhode Island Reds of '55 won the Calder Cup and had been celebrated as the greatest AHL team of all time. However, the team Jimmy returned to had just finished in dead last place the year before. Only 2 teammates remained from his old team. The Reds player of the century, Zellio Toppazini, coming off of a 30-goal season, and the team's second all-time leading scorer, center Paul Larivee. Topper and Larivee's line mate was fan favorite at left wing George Ranieri, who scored 30 goals as a rookie and led the team in scoring the previous season. In 1958, when George was playing for the Louisville Rebels of the International League, he had 124 points and 60 goals, both league records. For 4 straight seasons with the Reds, Ranieri would score more than 20 goals. Most teams at that time rotated 3 regular lines, 2 scoring lines, and a third line that was a more defensive-oriented line, with some spare players mixing in on the occasional shift. When he played in the NHL, Bartlett was used primarily to kill penalties and was normally assigned to the low-scoring checking lines because of his aggressive style of play. Whenever he was able to get some ice time with the Rangers, he wasn't skating on a line with star players like Hall of Famer Andy Bathgate, but with an ever-changing cast of characters made up with guys like Les Caldwell. Even when he was with the Reds in the 50s, Jimmy didn't play on the top line with Topper and Larivee. But Fernie recognized something in Bartlett that none of his other coaches had seen in him before, that at Bartlett's core, he was a goal scorer. Because Fernie personally saw Jimmy score 15 goals in the NHL the previous season while playing limited minutes on a third line with the historically bad Boston Bruins, Fernie knew that if Jimmy was paired with a talented, creative center for a change, and they were allowed the opportunity to develop some chemistry, Bartlett could finally reach his full potential. That's why Fernie decided to put Bartlett on a line with Stan Baluik. Stan Baluik was the star player on the '55 Kitchener Canucks, where he led the Ontario Junior League in scoring, playing on a line with Willie O'Ree. In 1956, Stan made his professional hockey debut with the same team Bartlett did in 1954, the Chicoutimi Saguenayens of the Quebec Hockey League. But Stan was already a professional athlete before he became a professional hockey player. That's because, like Bo Jackson and Deion Sanders, Stan Baluik was simultaneously a professional athlete in 2 sports. Baluik played hockey because he was Canadian, and everybody in Canada was supposed to play hockey. But his true love was golf. Stan competed in the Canadian Open when he was only 15 years old and turned pro in 1955, working as the club pro at the Fort Williams Country Club in Fort Williams during the off-season, where he also won several regional events. But even though he preferred the links to the ice, this didn't stop Baluik from becoming one of the slickest playmaking centers in the history of the Reds, where he averaged well over a point a game. In his first season with the Reds in 1959, Baluik led the team and was 4th in the entire league in scoring and was awarded the league's Rookie of the Year. Playing with his new line mate, Jimmy Bartlett, Stan would also lead the Reds in scoring in both the 1961 and '62 seasons. At right wing on the new line with Bartlett and Baluik was right winger Danny Poliziani. In 1957, Danny won the Calder Cup while playing for the Cleveland Barons, where he twice scored 20 goals before joining the Reds in 1958. In 1959, Danny led the Reds with 30 goals. For a third line, Fernie experimented with a line consisting of 3 Frenchmen, Jerry Ouellet, Serge Boudreault, and Pierre Brillant. Ouellet played 34 games the previous season with Bartlett in Boston before he was sent back down to the Kingston Frontenacs of the Eastern League. Jerry would struggle with the Reds and would be sent back to the Eastern League after 34 games. Although Ouellet never would play again in the NHL, he would eventually find success in the American Hockey League, playing 5 seasons for the Buffalo Bisons from 1965 to 1970. 22-year-old forward Serge Boudreault may have been only 5 foot 6 inches tall, but he could really fly on the ice, and he developed into the Reds' best defensive-minded forward. A hustling, gritty backchecker and expert penalty killer, Serge would play for the Reds until 1967, but was temporarily loaned by the team to the Baltimore Clippers in 1963. In 1967, Serge would be sent to the Columbus Checkers for the final 3 seasons of his professional career, where he finally got the chance to show off his scoring abilities, tallying 88 goals in the International League. After retiring from hockey, Serge would make Rhode Island his home, where he was a beloved member of the local community, coaching hockey at Cumberland High School for 12 seasons in the 70s and 80s before becoming a scout for the Philadelphia Flyers. Because French-Canadian right-winger Pierre Brillant was only 5'8" and had the reputation of being a non-physical, finesse-type player, he was never given the opportunity to play a single game in the NHL. Like Camille Henry in the 1950s, Pierre was a sharpshooter with a hard, accurate shot who could thread the eye of a needle. Because he was from the town of Rimouski, Quebec, he was given a fantastically cool nickname, the Rimouski Rifle. Brillant was born at the wrong place at the wrong time. No matter how many goals Brillant scored or how well he played, because his rights were owned by Montreal, he had no chance of making the Habs since they already had Rocket Richard and Boom Boom Jeffrey on at right wing. When Bartlett was playing in his final year in junior hockey with the St. Jerome Eagles, Pierre was a first-team All-Star for the Trois-Rivières Reds and was a teammate of Talbot in the game where he was suspended for hospitalizing Scotty Bowman. Prior to joining Providence, Pierre was a superstar for the Indianapolis Chiefs in the semi-pro International Hockey League, where he played for 5 years, becoming the first player to ever be named the MVP of the IHL in consecutive seasons, scoring 50 goals twice. When he came to the Reds in 1961, he would score 30 goals in each of his first 3 seasons. Brillant would eventually play his entire AHL career with Providence, scoring 165 goals, which is 6 on the team's all-time list. Joining player-coach Fernie Flamin on the blue line were a trio of defensemen. Eddie MacQueen was similar to Jimmy's former Bruins teammate Doug Mons. He was primarily used as a defenseman, where he was used regularly on the point during the power play because of his sizzling shot. But like Mons, Eddie was also used when needed as a winger. Eddie was from the northeast tip of Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia, where he'd been working in the miserable depths of a coal mine since he was 14 years old. In 1950, his brother called him on the phone and told him that he got Eddie a tryout with the Toronto Marlies junior hockey team, and that if he made the team, they would find him a job. So Eddie packed his suitcase and with only $40 in his pocket, took the train to Ontario with the hopes of finding a better life. It was the first time Eddie had ever been outside of Cape Breton in his life. Turning professional in 1954 with the Cleveland Barons, Eddie would win the Calder Cup with them in 1957. In a trade that general manager Muzz Patrick must have regretted, the Rangers traded Johnny Bower to the Cleveland Barons for the rights of Eddie MacQueen. Bower, of course, would go down as one of the greatest goalies of all time, while MacQueen would never play a single game in the NHL. The next year, the Rangers assigned Eddie to the Vancouver Canucks, where he played all season at right wing, winning the Western League's championship before he was then sold to the Providence Reds. Joining Eddie MacQueen on defense was a 23-year-old rookie, Matt Ravlich, who was a prospect of the Bruins who had played several seasons in the Eastern League. Although he was small for a defenseman, whenever he dropped the gloves, his devastating uppercut caused many opponents to require stitches in the dressing room. Returning to the team on the blue line was shot blocker extraordinaire Bob Blackburn, who was absolutely fearless in absorbing pain in order to prevent the puck from finding the back of the net. Blackie joined the Reds in 1959 and remained a solid and steady presence on defense for 7 seasons. In February 1966, he would be traded to the Vancouver Canucks in the Western League. He would return to the American League, where he would win the Eddie Shore Award as the league's best defenseman in 1969 as a member of the Buffalo Bisons. The NHL finally took notice, and after being sold by the Bisons to the New York Rangers, he was then poached by the Pittsburgh Penguins, where he eventually played 2 years before retiring after a final season with the Rochester Amerks. The 1961-62 Reds would platoon 2 goalies. The Reds acquired AHL legend Gil the Needle Mayer, who was starting his 13th season in the league. Mayer was the first goalie in the AHL to wear a face mask. He may have been tiny at 5'6" and $135, but this didn't stop the extremely athletic future AHL Hall of Famer from winning 2 Calder Cups as the goalie for the Pittsburgh Hornets in the early 1950s. Sharing duties with the Needle was a 22-year-old kid without much hockey experience, but with a lot of raw talent. His name was Eddie Giacomin. Giacomin was unique because he never played junior hockey, where almost every other hockey player learns their craft. While Eddie was 18 years old, he was working in a chemical plant while his older brother Raleigh was the backup goalie for the Eastern League semi-pro team, the Washington Eagles. Because Eddie's brother couldn't get off from work to fill in as the emergency backup, the team asked Eddie to fill in for his older brother. Winning 4 straight games and catching the eyes of a Providence scout, he was signed by the Reds, joining the team in 1960. When he showed up at training camp, he didn't tell the team that during the summer before camp, his legs were severely burned in a house fire. According to Eddie, if the team had seen the condition of his burns, he would never have made the team. The highly durable Giacomin was famous for his acrobatic, sprawling style of goaltending and would thrill the fans by wandering far from his crease in order to reach the puck and pass it up to a teammate on the breakaway. Giacomin was one of Bartlett's closest friends on the team. Jimmy would often stay late after practice in order to work with and tutor the young brilliant netminder. While new coach Fernie Flamin was busy preparing a squad for the new season, nobody else in the sporting world was paying any attention to hockey. The entire world instead was obsessed in the summer of 1961 with the New York Yankees, while their sluggers Mickey Mantle and Roger Maris were chasing Babe Ruth's magic number of 60 home runs. On October 1st, 1961, on the final game of the season, and facing enormous pressure, Roger Maris connected in the 4th inning with his historic 61st home run off of Red Sox pitcher Tracy Stallard. Although it was only supposed to be an exhibition match, the hometown Rhode Island Reds and the Boston Bruins put on a fast and violent show for the fans during an interleague game at the Rhode Island Auditorium on October 7, 1961. The Boston Bruins were Jimmy's teammates from just a few months earlier, and they were being led by their brand new coach, Fiery Phil Watson, who had just swapped places with Bartlett. 5 months earlier, Jimmy was playing for the Bruins and Phil was coaching Providence. With the score tied at 1 in the first period, Reds defenseman Dino Mascotto elbowed Charlie Burns in the mouth, causing them both to start going at it, with Dino eventually wrestling Burns down to the ice. Meanwhile, at the other end of the ice, the fans were thrilled when Jimmy squared off against new Bruin tough guy, Orland Kurtenbach, with both of them throwing and landing heavy punches before being banished to the penalty box. That summer, the 6'2", 25-year-old Kurtenbach had been drafted from the New York Rangers by the Bruins in the interleague draft, with the intent for him to basically be Bartlett's replacement. In the second period, the Reds took the lead 4-2 after an unassisted goal by Zellio Toppazini. 38 seconds later, Bartlett closed out the period scoring with a deft backhander over the prostrate goalie after dashing the length of the ice through the entire Boston squad. After his goal, Bartlett skated past the Bruin bench and gave Coach Phil Watson a big smile. Bartlett added 2 assists in the Reds' victory to complete the Gordie Howe hat trick and further sticking it to his old team. Although a quiet and unassuming guy off the ice, during the game, Orland Kurtenbach was a no-nonsense tough guy who never hesitated to drop the gloves to protect a teammate. He used to wear thin white gloves under his hockey gloves because the leather gave his hands a rash. So whenever he fought, fans couldn't miss seeing the white gloves that were nicknamed his boxing gloves. He was considered to be one of the best fighters in all of professional hockey. Before being poached by the Bruins, the Rangers had assigned Orland to the Vancouver Canucks of the Western League, where he played 3 seasons, scoring 20 goals in 1960. However, after playing only 8 games this season for the Boston Bruins, Phil Watson would assign Kurtenbach to the Rhode Island Reds, where he would play the rest of the season, eventually scoring 31 goals. For the 1961 season, the American Hockey League divided itself into an Eastern and Western division for the first time. Although the Reds were assigned to the East with Hershey, Springfield, and Quebec, their opening game was against the best team in the West, the Cleveland Barons. The Barons won 4 Calder Cup championships during the 1950s, and their excellence continued into the 60s, with Cleveland easily winning the West. They were led by the league's MVP and biggest star, Fred Glover. But the Barons didn't enjoy all that success based on the talents of Glover himself. The Barons also featured a strong defense behind a pair of veteran defensemen. Bill Needham played 981 games for the Cleveland Barons, more than any other player. Making his debut with the team in 1956, Needham would spend the next 15 seasons with the club, winning the Calder Cup in 1964. In 1968, he would win the Eddie Shore Award as the league's best defenseman. After he retired, Needham returned to Cleveland to coach the Cleveland Crusaders for 2 seasons in the World Hockey Association. Defenseman Tommy Red Williams joined the Cleveland Barons on Christmas night 1948 and played the next 7 seasons with the club, winning the Calder Cup 3 times. After being traded to Rochester in 1956, he would return to Cleveland in 1961 for a second stint with the club and would win another championship in 1964 in his final season. During the 1950s, Tommy Williams was named the first-team All-Star twice and second-team All-Star 3 times. In 1980, both Bill Needham and Red Williams were inducted into the Cleveland Sports Hall of Fame. The Rhode Island Reds were simply spectacular in their season-opening 9-1 blowout win against the Cleveland Barons that occurred on October 11, 1961. At 2:30 of the first period, Poliziani opened the scoring after some nifty passes from line mates Bartlett and Baluik. After an unassisted goal by Larivee and a power play tip-in by Ouellette, Jimmy also found the back of the net in the first period when he whipped home a sizzling shot after a gorgeous passing attack from Poliziani and Baluik. By the end of the first period, the Reds held a 6-0 lead. In the second period, Jimmy extended the lead to 7-0 after cleanly faking out goalie Les Benkley for his second goal of the night while on a 2-on-1 breakaway with Poliziani. At the end of the game, the Reds fans gave a standing ovation for the team's exceptional performance. Unfortunately for the team, the brilliance of that game was followed by a mediocre start of the season, including a 5-game losing streak in the middle of November. On November 26, the Reds faced the Rochester Americans after a 3-game winning streak resulted in the Reds fighting back to regain a .500 record for the season. The Amherst were coached by Johnny Crawford, Jimmy's former coach when he won the Calder Cup with the Reds back in the 50s. In the Rochester net was Donnie Simmons, Jimmy's old teammate from the Bruins. With the Reds trailing 1-0, Bartlett tipped in the tying goal off of a 30-footer by Fernie Flamin while the Reds were on a 5-on-3 power play with 31 seconds left of the first period. After Rochester regained in the second period, Jimmy tied the score again by knocking in a Poliziani rebound. However, although Larry Leach's goal gave the team a 3-2 lead, the Providence defense fell apart in the game's final 5 minutes, blowing the game at home in the final minute when Rochester's Dick Gamble scored his 3rd goal of the night. Although the team again fell below .500, the red-hot Jimmy Bartlett had scored his 9th goal in only 13 games. The wildest game of the season took place on Christmas Day at the auditorium between the Reds and Eddie Shore's Springfield Indians. Springfield, who had won the Calder Cup with Jimmy 2 years earlier and repeated as champions the next year, were seeking to become the only team in AHL history to three-peat. In the second period, 4 violent fights broke out amongst both teams' defensemen, with player-coach Fernie Flamin dropping the gloves and fighting Springfield defenseman Kent Douglas, not once, but twice, each time with the old veteran coach easily prevailing over the young Springfield heavyweight defenseman. According to the Reds Heritage Society, Fernie toyed with him for a few seconds, then gripped Douglas by the seat of his pants and nape of the neck and casually hurled him into the Indians' net, where the embarrassed young defenseman needed the help of teammates in order to emerge from his entanglement with the goal mesh. With the score deadlocked at 1 heading into the third period, Fernie's pugilistic heroics proved to be inspirational. At 7:29 of the third period, Jimmy assisted on a goal by Poliziani prior to taking a sweet pass from Serge Boudreault and firing the puck past goaltender Marcel Paillet to give the Reds a 2-goal lead. However, the defending champs then scored twice to deadlock the game at 3, causing the Providence fans to groan with anticipation of a heartbreaking defeat. However, the groans quickly turned to cheers when Poliziani scored 2 more times in the game's final 5 minutes for a hat-trick and a 5-3 win. Jimmy Bartlett had a very Merry Christmas with 4 points in the third period against his old team. By February, the team was struggling and had dropped to last place in the Eastern Conference. A win against Buffalo would allow the team to tie the Quebec Aces for third. However, when they met the Buffalo Bisons on February 7th, the team was so devastated by injuries they needed to call up a few guys from the Eastern League in order to even roster a team. With the team trailing 2-0, Jimmy scored 2 consecutive goals in the second period to tie the score. Despite the comeback, Buffalo scored the next 3 goals to take a 5-2 lead. In the middle of the third period, Jimmy was all alone on Buffalo's goalie Dennis DeJordy and was about to take his shot when he was tripped from behind by Ed Van Imp. The referee immediately awarded Bartlett a very rare penalty shot opportunity. Bartlett, who dubbed himself Never Miss, skated on DeJordy and had him beat with a successful fake to the right, but when Bartlett fired at the big opening he created, DeJordy was somehow able to deflect the puck off of his right leg, preventing Jimmy from completing the hat trick. 4 days later, the Reds hosted Quebec at home with the hopes that a win would put them into a tie with the Aces for the last playoff spot. Bartlett wasted no time putting the Reds on the scoreboard, scoring in the first 26 seconds of the game. However, Quebec struck back and in an exciting back-and-forth game were leading 4-3 with less than 2 minutes remaining on the clock in the third period. After goaltender Charlie Hodge was able to deflect Poliziani's shot from the right side of the cage, Jimmy was able to quickly fire the rebound into the open left corner of the net to send the game into sudden death overtime. Although the Reds completely dominated the OT period, the hockey gods were not smiling on the Reds that night as one unlucky bad bounce after another prevented Rhode Island from scoring. Unfortunately, Quebec rookie winger Reggie Grigg was able to beat Giacomin with only 16 seconds left of the sudden death overtime period to give the Aces a stunning 5-4 victory and a 4-point lead over the Reds in the standings. It was the Reds' 4th loss in a row and the season was slipping away. On February 17th, the Reds were blown out by the Cleveland Barons 9-2 for their 7th consecutive loss. Something needed to change. When the Soviets launched Sputnik in 1957 to begin the space race, the Americans quickly found themselves way behind. While the American rockets kept blowing up, the Russians were able to successfully send the dog Laika into space and then further embarrass the Americans when in April 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to ever journey into outer space aboard the Vostok 1 spacecraft. Meanwhile, the NASA engineers, scientists, and the mission control personnel faced numerous challenges and overcame seemingly insurmountable obstacles, but they never quit. And on February 20th, 1962, the Americans finally caught up to the Soviets in the space race. U.S. astronaut John Glenn rode the Atlas rocket and orbited the Earth 3 times before splashing down safely in his Friendship 7 space capsule, becoming America's greatest hero since Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic. Glenn's inspirational space flight was a shining example of the power of teamwork, perseverance, and the belief that through collective hard work towards a shared objective, any obstacle can be overcome and extraordinary accomplishments can be achieved. Godspeed, the Rhode Island Reds. At the time of John Glenn's historic flight, the Reds only had 14 games left to play. But the Rhode Island Reds were inspired and finally caught fire, playing up to their full potential. The Reds got so hot that they would lose only 1 game during the final 6 weeks of the season. On March 2, 1962, the Reds were trailing the Rochester Amerks 3-1 heading into the third period. So Coach Flamin decided to switch up the lines a bit, adding Pierre Brillant to the line with Stan Baluik and Jimmy Bartlett. In the third period, Bartlett closed the gap with an assist from Brillant, and a late goal by Paul Larivee sent the game into sudden death overtime. Brillant scored the game winner 32 seconds into overtime, shocking the Rochester fans. During the team's winning streak, the Baluik, Bartlett, and Brillant line began to skate more and more shifts together. On March 5th, the Reds organization hosted a testimonial dinner to honor the team's all-time greatest player, Zellio Toppazini. On March 18th, Orland Kurtenbach scored 3 goals and had 3 assists in Rhode Island's 8-3 blowout win over the Pittsburgh Hornets. The win was the red-hot team's 8th win in 9 games and moved the team into the coveted 3rd place in the standings and into the playoffs. Jimmy also had a pair of goals in the game and assisted on a goal by Brillant. On April 1st, the Reds closed out their season at the Auditorium in a wild game against the Quebec Aces. Early in the first period, with the Reds shorthanded, Bartlett took a neat little drop pass from Baluik and fired a 15-footer into the net for the first goal of the night. Kurtenbach made it 2-0 for the Reds, but the Aces scored 2 goals within the next minute to end the period deadlocked at 2-2. In the second period, Quebec took a 5-3 lead. However, Bartlett scored again when he successfully banked a shot off of Quebec defenseman Jim Morrison's leg from a deep angle, and then Jimmy assisted on a tie-in goal by Stan Baluik. When Stan scored, an excited fan threw a live rooster on the ice. Less than a minute after the game restarted, Reds defenseman Dino Moscato would score his only goal of the season to give the Reds a 6-5 lead. With the team leading 9-7 in the third period, Bartlett scored his third goal of the night with assists from Baluik and Brillant for Jimmy's first hat trick since the one he had with the Rangers in 1959 against the Leafs and Johnny Bower. Stan Baluik led the team in scoring that year with 81 points, and Brillant led the team with 37 goals. Bartlett ended the season with outstanding numbers himself, averaging more than a point a game and scoring 31 goals in only 62 games. During the Reds' hot streak, Bartlett had 25 points in the team's final 15 games. For the season, Jimmy was tied overall for second on the team in both total points and in goals. Kurtenbach was fourth in scoring, having had a terrific year scoring 31 goals, while Topper finished fifth, scoring 20 goals for the final time in his tremendous career. In a weird playoff format, the first-place winners of the East, the Springfield Indians, met the first-place winners of the West, the Cleveland Barons, in a 7-game series. Meanwhile, the second and third-place teams in each division would play a 3-game series with the winners playing each other in another 3-game series before facing the winner of the Springfield-Cleveland series in the finals. On April 3, 1962, riding a 7-game winning streak, the Reds flew to Hershey to face the Bears on Game 1, confident that they were going to have a long playoff run. Hershey was led by the player who would eventually become the American Hockey League's all-time scorer, the great Willie Marshall, and also featured future Boston Bruins star winger John McKenzie. After getting blown out by the Hershey Bears in Game 1, 7-2, the Reds tied the series with a 3-1 victory at the Auditorium. In the decisive final Game 3 of the series, the Reds were losing 2-0 in the third period. After Kurtenbach scored to cut Hershey's lead in half, Bob Beckett sent the series into sudden death overtime after taking a beautiful pass from Toppazini, who made the play despite getting elbowed in the face from Larry Zeidel, which caused Topper to lose 2 front teeth. However, despite the team's clutch play, Kiki Mortson scored the winning goal for the Bears in overtime, ending the Reds' season. Hershey would lose in the second-round series to the Buffalo Bisons, who would then lose to Eddie Shore's Springfield Indians, who became the only team in AHL history to win the Calder Cup championship 3 years in a row. After the season, Brillant was named the runner-up for the league's Rookie of the Year to the Cleveland Barons goalie Les Benkley. While living in New England, Jimmy fell in love with another sport that replaced ice hockey as his favorite. Jimmy became friends in Providence with George Handy, who had won the Purple Heart during World War II when his ship was hit by a kamikaze pilot. Handy was proud of the fact that he was able to flip the bird to the Japanese pilot the moment before he crashed his plane into the ship. When he returned after the war in 1946, George Handy became a legendary trainer of thoroughbred racehorses, which he continued to do for more than the next 70 years, with the New England Horse Racing Hall of Famer finally retiring in 2018 at the age of 96. Even as an old man, the colorful Handy remained famous for cruising around in his orange convertible sports cars with a beautiful woman by his side. Whenever Jimmy went to the track, he was as enthusiastic as a child going to the circus for the first time. Although he enjoyed betting the ponies, the gambling wasn't the point. The horses were. It was the awe-inspiring majesty of these beautiful, powerful, and graceful animals racing at thrilling speeds that caused Bartlett's heart to pound faster and faster with excitement. Jimmy always made sure to live near a racetrack. Jamaica and Belmont when he was in New York, Suffolk Downs in Boston, Narragansett Park in Providence, Pimlico and Timonium in Baltimore, and Tampa Bay Downs in Florida. The athlete Bartlett most admired during his hockey career was not Gordie Howe or Rocket Richard. It was either Eddie Arcaro or Willie Shoemaker. Whenever one of Handy's horses won a race, he would invite Jimmy into the winner's circle. On the copies of the winner's circle pictures, my dad used to take a Sharpie and write his name next to the owner's name. I have no idea why he did this, but I don't think he was trying to impress or deceive anybody, because his magic marker editions never came anywhere close to matching the fonts of the original. I think he just liked living the fantasy, because if Bartlett would have played hockey during the modern era and retired a multimillionaire, I have no doubt at all that nothing would have made him happier in this world than opening a horse farm and having his own stable of thoroughbreds. The American Hockey League expanded to 9 teams to begin the 1962-63 season, when the city of Baltimore was awarded a franchise. Terry Reardon had been a fixture in Providence since 1947 as a player, a coach, and finally as general manager. Terry Reardon, the man who bought Bartlett from the Bruins, resigned from the Reds and was named the new general manager for the expansion Baltimore Clippers. Before the season began, Paul Larivee retired after 10 seasons with the Reds as the team's second all-time leading scorer. The team also took a major hit when they lost Orland Kurtenbach, who was traded by Boston to San Francisco of the Western Hockey League. However, after he had a great year out west, Boston had seller's remorse and bought him back. Kurtenbach played for the Bruins in 1963 and 1964, was traded to the Maple Leafs in 1965, and then was poached by the Rangers, where he played for 4 seasons. Like Bartlett's previous NHL experience on all 3 teams, Kurtenbach was utilized primarily as a checking forward on the third line with very limited ice time. However, he was named the team's first ever captain when he was drafted by the Vancouver Canucks in the 1970 NHL expansion draft. For the first time in his NHL career, Orland was given the opportunity to play on a top line, and he responded by scoring 21 goals in 1970 and 24 goals in 1971. The highly popular fan favorite, who had won the Rookie of the Year in 1957 when he originally played for the Canucks while they were still in the Western League, would retire after playing 4 seasons with Vancouver, eventually coaching the club in 1976. In 2020, Kurtenbach became the first Canucks player to be inducted into that team's Ring of Honor. The Reds added some forwards to replace Larivee and Kurtenbach. The Bruins reassigned lanky center Larry Leach to the Reds from the Portland Buckaroos of the Western League. The Reds bought the contract for the old veteran and future American Hockey League Hall of Famer Harry Pidherney from the Montreal Canadiens. Montreal had purchased the rights for Harry the year before from Eddie Shore and had signed the long-term Springfield Indian to the San Francisco Seals of the Western Hockey League the previous year. Back in 1953, Pidherney had tied the American Hockey League record when he humiliated the Rhode Island Reds by scoring 6 goals against them in a single game for a double hat trick. The Reds also purchased veteran Eddie Mazur from the Cleveland Barons. The 6'3" gangly slick stick handler, who was nicknamed the Spider, was capable of playing either wing or defense. For 3 consecutive seasons, the Montreal Canadiens called Mazur up from the minors to play in the Stanley Cup playoffs. In 1953, Mazur was actually on the ice playing on a line with Elmer Locke and Rocket Richard, his boyhood heroes, when Richard scored the Stanley Cup winning goal, and Eddie became the first player in history to have scored 4 goals in the Stanley Cup Finals before ever playing a single NHL regular season game. Between 1953 and 1955, Eddie would play 92 games with the Habs, used primarily on the third line or as a utility man, but would then spend the remainder of his career in the AHL. Mazur was named the second-team All-Star for the Rochester Amerks for the 1956-57 season. In 1958, he was traded to the Cleveland Barons, where he was again named the second-team All-Star. Eddie would score 117 goals in his 4 seasons with the Barons before they sold him to Providence. The Reds were also able to strengthen their defensive core when they bought the rights to future AHL Hall of Fame defenseman and longtime former Cleveland Baron and Rochester American Steve Krafchick from the Toronto Maple Leafs. On August 4, 1962, 2 months before the season began, the winds of fate blew out the candle of the 36-year-old goddess of sex, Marilyn Monroe. Although the official cause of death was ruled a probable suicide, questions concerning the mysterious circumstances surrounding her death and whether it was related to the rumors of an affair with President Kennedy have continued to persist. Like a gourmet chef attempting to find the perfect balance of ingredients, Coach Flamin had the responsibility of creating new lines to start the upcoming year. However, there was one line that Fernie announced would be left intact for the upcoming season. According to the coach, the line of Baluik, Brillant, and Bartlett murdered the opposition the previous year, and it would be a huge mistake to tamper with the chemistry that produced so many goals the season before. The line was given the nickname the B line, and it became one of the most famous lines in American Hockey League history. At center, Stan Baluik, the master craftsman, the line's quarterback, an expert in setting up the plays. At right wing, Pierre Brillant, the goal-getter of the unit. And at left wing, the irrepressible Jim Bartlett. He digs them out of the corners and has an explosive shot. On October 16, 1962, President Kennedy was briefed that American U-2 spy planes discovered evidence of Soviet nuclear missile sites being constructed in Cuba, posing a direct threat to national security. For the next 13 days, the world watched anxiously and held its collective breath as the world's two superpowers went toe-to-toe, with Kennedy and Khrushchev engaging in the highest-stakes poker game imaginable. On October 22nd, President Kennedy announced to the American public a naval blockade of Cuba and met with his military advisors about a possible invasion. With Soviet ships threatening to break the quarantine, the world was brought to the brink of nuclear war. On October 25th, the American military went on high alert with the U.S. Armed Forces raised to DEFCON 2, the highest state of readiness short of war. Fear swept the country as the public faced the existential threat of an imminent nuclear holocaust. However, these events did not prevent the loyal Rhode Island fans from jamming into the auditorium to watch their hometown heroes take on the Cleveland Barons. On October 26, 1962, at 9:07 of the third period, with the game tied at 1-1, Jimmy Bartlett gathered up a loose puck and fired a 10-footer into the open left corner for the game-winning goal to the delight of the Providence fans. Within a few days, President Kennedy would famously and courageously reject the advice of his hawkish advisors and would brilliantly de-escalate the crisis and successfully negotiate the removal of the Cuban missiles. Although the game itself was of no historic significance at all and is completely forgotten today, the Rhode Island fans in attendance that night were able to experience a brief and happy distraction from the prevailing anxieties and fears and find comfort and camaraderie instead in the joy of watching a winning game, proving that sports has the power to unite and uplift even during the darkest of times. Or let me put it this way. At the moment the United States was on the brink of nuclear war with the Russians, Jimmy's goal not only caused thousands of loyal, patriotic Americans to temporarily forget about this imminent threat, but to cause them to simultaneously cheer and enthusiastically chant, not for the USA, 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 but instead for the Reds, Reds, Reds. On the November 16th Reds 8-3 blowout win over the Cleveland Barons, line mates Bartlett and Baluik each picked up assists on both of Pierre Brillant's second-period goals. Later in the period, Bartlett received a minor and a major for a fight against Cleveland player-coach Fred Glover, which almost turned into a free-for-all. In the third period, Jimmy took a pass from Krafchick for the Reds' final goal of the night, completing the Gordie Howe hat trick. 2 days later, Bartlett was the key playmaker in the Reds' 8-2 shellacking of the defending champions, Springfield Indians. In the first period, Jimmy set up Brillant for the first goal of the game before scoring himself to give the Reds a 2-0 lead. In the second period, with the Reds leading 2-1, Bartlett set up a goal by Baluik and then set up Brillant again for a 4-point game. The B line was on fire. On December 2nd, the B line again dominated Springfield with the team's best performance of the season. After Larivee scored for the Reds in the first minute of the game, Bartlett picked up a long pass from Ravlich at Springfield's blue line and fired a 30-footer into the top right corner of the net, despite having defenseman Ted Harris hanging all over him. In the second period, Baluik made it 3-0 when he knocked in a Bartlett rebound before scoring a second time with assists from his B line mates Bartlett and Brillant. With less than a minute to go in the period, Brillant scored the Reds' fifth goal of the game. In the third period, Bartlett again completed the Gordie Howe hat trick when he had a fist fight with Springfield's Wally Boyer. Rhode Island's 5-2 victory pulled the team within 1 point of first place behind the Quebec Aces. On Christmas Day, the Reds were leading 1-0 in the second period when Bill Sweeney tied the score for Springfield. 21 seconds later, Bartlett scored the tying goal from just outside of the crease after taking a nice feed from Baluik. After the Indians responded with a second period goal of their own, the teams headed into the final period with the score tied. 2 minutes into the third period, Jimmy took a sweet pass from Stan Baluik when the two were on a 2-on-1 breakaway, and Bartlett scored the game winner with a 20-foot shot from the left side in the Reds' 4-2 victory over the Springfield Indians. On February 10th, the Reds scored 4 goals in the game's final 6 minutes to defeat the expansion Baltimore Clippers 5-2. Serge Boudreault, who was on loan to Baltimore at the time, actually played a hard-nosed physical game against his Rhode Island teammates. Bartlett received a 5-minute major after a vicious hit that opened up a cut over Boudreaux's eye that required 11 stitches. After the game, Bartlett felt it was necessary to rebut the allegations that he had purposely cut Serge with his stick, insisting that Boudreaux's cut occurred when his face smacked into the ice after Bartlett already nailed him.
"I like to have it understood that I didn't hit Serge with my stick. I can take care of myself with any of them without having to use my stick."
On February 19, 1963, The Feminine Mystique was published by Betty Friedan. This groundbreaking work sparked the modern feminist movement of the 1960s. In her book, Friedan argued that the American woman has become dissatisfied, depressed, and unfulfilled by the unlimited roles available to them in society, and how the media and popular culture reinforced the idea that a woman's primary purpose was to be nothing more than a subservient housewife and mother. Instead, women should be given the same opportunity as men in all areas of education, careers, and personal fulfillment. While trailing 1-0 on March 2nd, Jimmy took a pass from Topper on the power play in the first period and slapped in a 20-footer for the tying goal. In the third period, with the Reds trailing 2-1, Bartlett tied the score again before Baluik and George Ranieri lit the lamp in the Rhode Island Reds' 4-2 victory against the Pittsburgh Hornets. With the Bears and Reds tied for first place, Rhode Island played before a standing room-only packed crowd in Hershey on March 9th. The Bears had the former NHL goalie Ed Chadwick. When future Hall of Fame goalie Harry Lumley got injured with 5 games left of the 1955 season, the Toronto Maple Leafs replaced him with Ed Chadwick. Ed would play the next 140 consecutive games in the net for Toronto, which is still a Maple Leaf record. However, in 1959, he was demoted to Rochester. While he was with the Americans, Chadwick was both a first-team and second-team All-Star before being traded to the Hershey Bears in 1961. In 1964, Ed's rights would get purchased by the Chicago Blackhawks, who would then send him to the Buffalo Bisons, where he again was named the second-team All-Star, before retiring after playing there until 1968. After he retired as a player, Chadwick would win 5 Stanley Cups as a scout for the Edmonton Oilers. Bartlett and Hershey's Howie Janusek were both put in the penalty box for roughing in the first 30 seconds of the game when Ravlich scored for the Reds with both teams a man down. As soon as Jimmy was released from the penalty box, he took a long pass from Fernie Flamin and fired a hard shot past Chadwick to give the Reds a 2-0 lead. In the second period, a goal by Pinherney and a second Bartlett goal and 2 assists put the game out of reach as the Reds easily defeated Hershey 6-2 to gain sole possession of first place. However, the team's celebration was short-lived. On the next night, while playing against Springfield, Jimmy suffered the most serious injury in his hockey career when he crashed into the boards to the right of the Springfield cage in the first period. Jimmy was rushed to the emergency room when a stray hockey stick accidentally struck him in the face and caused his right eye to hemorrhage. At the time, there were serious concerns that he could lose his eye and end his hockey career. While still recovering from his eye injury, on March 16, 1963, Jimmy received the news that his father, Fred Bartlett, had died at the age of 55. Because his dad was ill, Jimmy's parents visited their son in Rhode Island during the off-season and were able to spend some time with the grandkids, Melinda and JJ. On March 29, 1963, Jimmy played his first game back after his eye injury that occurred 19 days earlier. Giacomin had a shutout and Bartlett scored a goal in the Reds' 6-0 blowout win over the Rochester Americans. 2 days later, in the last game of the season, the Reds blew out the winner of the West Division, the Buffalo Bisons. In the first period, Bartlett set up Ravlich and Brillant for both of Rhode Island's goals. Jimmy then scored the first goal of the second period to give Providence a 3-1 lead. Bartlett added another goal in the first 2 minutes of the third period and assisted Baluik on the Reds' last goal of the game. Jimmy's 5-point game was a hell of a way to end the season. Unlike the previous year, Fernie Flamin's team finished the 62-63 season in first place in the Eastern Division. Once again, Baluik led the team in scoring, followed by Bartlett, then Brillant. Brillant again led the team with 35 goals, followed by Bartlett, who knocked in 28. In the first round of the playoffs, Rhode Island was scheduled to play the Buffalo Bisons, who had finished in first place in the Western Division, with the winner getting a bye in the second round and advancing to the finals. As one of the slickest playmaking centers in American Hockey League history, Buffalo's Art Stratton led the league in assists and finished fourth overall in scoring. 2 weeks earlier, on St. Patrick's Day, Stratton had one of the greatest games ever played at any level by a professional hockey player when he had a record 9 assists in a single game against the Pittsburgh Hornets. At the end of the season, Stratton was named first-team All-Star for the first of 3 consecutive seasons and was named the league's MVP in 1964. Unfortunately for Stratton, no matter how well he played, he could not find a stable hockey home, and he spent his 20-year pro career constantly bouncing from team to team around the various leagues. After scoring 29 goals for Cleveland as a rookie, he was sold to the New York Rangers. When Jimmy Bartlett was banished to Eddie Shore in Springfield in 1960, it was Stratton who was promoted to the Rangers from Springfield to replace him for the rest of the season, before they traded him to Chicago, who then sent him to Buffalo. In 1965, he would be assigned to the St. Louis Flyers in the newly established Central Pro Hockey League, where he was named MVP in both of his seasons there. When the NHL expanded in 1967, Stratton was drafted by the Penguins, and he was able to play the entire season in the NHL. However, he was traded to the Flyers in the middle of the year, who then traded Art to the Seattle Totems of the Western League. After playing 4 years out west, he was back in the AHL. In 1974, as a member of the Rochester Amerks, Stratton again led the AHL in assists and was once again named the league's MVP. Stratton made his final AHL appearance with the Richmond Robins in the 1974-75 season, where he averaged nearly a point per game at age 38 and was eventually inducted into the American Hockey League Hall of Fame. Stratton's teammate on the Bisons was their dependable and consistent forward, Billy Day. In 1956, when he was only 23, Billy Day scored 15 goals for the Detroit Red Wings. However, when he was traded the next season to the Blackhawks, he was then assigned to the Buffalo Bisons, where he would score more than 20 goals in each of his 9 seasons with the team. In 1965, Day became the AHL's Iron Man when he played in his 525th straight game. Despite being a very clean player who was only 5'8", Day played a very physical game and earned the nickname Hard Rock. Day was drafted by Pittsburgh in the 67 expansion draft, where he scored 16 goals as a teammate once again with Art Stratton. In 1969, he was traded back to Detroit, where he played 2 more years in the NHL, eventually coaching the team in 1981. In 2017, Billy Day was also inducted into the AHL Hall of Fame. After destroying the Bisons 9-1 in the last game of the season, the Reds entered the playoffs against Buffalo a bit too overconfident. In Game 1, Buffalo humiliated Providence 10-2. In Game 2, the Bison's goalie Dennis DeJordy pitched a shutout as Buffalo easily won 2-0. Playing back home in Providence, Jimmy scored a goal in the first period and set up Brillant for a goal in the third as the Reds were able to take Game 3 of the series 6-4. In Game 4, the Reds jumped out to a 2-0 lead behind first period goals from Poliziani and Brillant, who was assisted by his B-line mates Bartlett and Baluik. After Art Stratton scored in the second period, John McKenzie tied the game at 12:18 of the third. However, the Reds caught fire in the final 6 minutes of the game, with Baluik scoring twice and Topper knocking one in for a 5-2 victory and tying the series. However, the Reds were crushed 8-1 in Game 5. During the entire game, the fans booed and heckled Bartlett, which was pretty standard stuff because Bartlett was universally hated by opposing fans wherever he played. Bartlett loved playing the heel. The more the fans booed, the larger the big smile on his face. However, in the last minute of the second period, a free-for-all broke out behind the Providence bench when a Buffalo fan threw a carton of beer at Jimmy Bartlett and then punched him in the back of the head. Big mistake. In seconds, Bartlett and his teammates were crawling into the stands and began fighting with the fans. Eventually, with the help of police, order was eventually restored. It was reported that the fan who started the violence had taken off, but not before he had received his lumps. In Game 6, back at the auditorium, the teams were tied 1-1 when Giacomin made a brilliant save off of a terrific shot by John McKenzie. Unfortunately, Art Stratton was able to knock in the rebound for the game winner in the 15th minute of the final period, stunning the Reds and eliminating them from the playoffs. The Buffalo Bisons would move on to the finals, defeating the Hershey Bears and winning the Calder Cup, while all the Reds could do was lick their wounds and wait for the next season. As always, the Reds were forced to make changes to the roster for the upcoming year. Coach Fernie Flamin would only play 22 games during the 63-64 season, instead dedicating his time to coaching and management duties. To try to replace him, the Reds promoted defenseman Gil Moffitt from the EHL New Haven Blades. Topper was also winding down his legendary career, playing only 14 games that season. Old veteran center Harry Pidherney left the team when he signed a contract to play for the Baltimore Clippers, and goalie Gil Mayer decided to retire from hockey when he abruptly quit the team to become a rug salesman. The Reds also bought 32-year-old veteran center Norm Corcoran, who had twice scored 20 goals for Hershey in the early 50s but was now past his peak. But the most important change involved trading away winger Dan Poliziani to the Hershey Bears. After playing 2 years in Hershey, Poliziani retired from hockey after the 64 season and would take up a new career training racehorses, which he did for the rest of his life. I can't imagine, though, any parent being more proud than Poliziani must have been for his son, Danny, who would eventually win the Ivy League Player of the Year while playing for the Yale hockey team. But coming to the Reds in the trade was the one and only Willie Marshall, the man who would one day become the American Hockey League's all-time scorer. After Marshall and Hershey eliminated Bartlett and the Reds in the playoffs in both 1958 and 1962, it was better to be playing with Willie as opposed to against him. Jimmy didn't know it yet, but in Bartlett's long hockey career, Willie Marshall would play more games as his teammate than any other player. Jimmy also now had the letter A sewn into his sweater as Fernie named him alternate captain. It didn't take Willie Marshall long to fit in with his new team. On October 27, 1963, while playing on a line with George Ranieri and Norm Corcoran, Willie had the greatest game in his illustrious career when he scored 5 goals in the Reds' 7-1 blowout victory over the Springfield Indians. Willie also received an additional assist when he set up a neat goal by Jimmy Bartlett when changing on the fly in the third period. On November 14th, Jimmy was taken to the hospital after he thought he had fractured some of his ribs during a game. Fortunately, Jimmy's x-rays revealed that his ribs were merely bruised. Legendary team trainer George Army applied his special taping and heat treatment and promised that Bartlett would be ready to rejoin the team for their next game 3 days later against the Amherst. In the 1930s, George Army was a hell of a minor league baseball catcher. In 1934, Army was hired by the Reds as the team's trainer, a position he would keep for the next 46 years. Although he had no medical training at all, he immersed himself in medical and anatomy books and taught himself the best way to treat hockey injuries. He even learned how to stitch facial wounds by slicing orange peels at home and then stitching them back together again. When I was a kid, whenever I sprained my ankle or twisted my knee or something, my dad would hose my injury down by blasting it with ice-cold water. It used to hurt like hell, and I hated it, but he told me that that's what George Army used to do. Thank God he didn't give me the Eddie Shore treatment. As promised, Jimmy's ribs were healed by George Army's magic, and he was given a clean bill of health before the team's next game. On November 17, 1963, the B-line had its best game of the year in the Reds' 9-2 win over Rochester. Baluik had a hat trick, Brillant scored 2 goals, with Bartlett serving as the B-line's playmaker with 4 assists. However, no matter how important the B-line's 5-goal performance might have felt to the fans at that moment, the memories of the B-line's brilliant performance would be universally and instantly forgotten 5 days later, because on November 22, 1963, America lost her innocence as the sound of gunshots awoke her from the dream of Camelot. But the show must go on, right? Even though it had only been 3 days since President Kennedy had been buried, and most of the country was still deep in mourning, the game played on. Jimmy scored against Roger Crozier in the Reds' 5-2 win over the Pittsburgh Hornets on November 28, 1963. On December 15th, the Reds demolished the Baltimore Clippers 8-1, increasing their first-place lead in the Eastern Division. With the team leading 3-1, defenseman Gil Moffitt's poke check sent the B-line into the Baltimore zone on a 3-on-1 breakaway. Stan passed to Pierre on his right side, who immediately fed the puck back to Jimmy, trailing the play on the left, who sizzled a 20-footer past goaltender Gilles Boisvert in the prettiest play of the night. Bartlett added another goal in the game's final 5 minutes. On January 5, 1964, Eddie Giacomin had 40 saves, and the Reds ended their 2-game losing streak when they defeated Springfield 5-3 at a home game in the Auditorium. Bartlett scored the first goal of the game in the 5th minute of play when the B-line broke out on a 3-on-1 breakaway. Baluik passed to Brillant inside the Springfield zone, who then skated practically to the goal mouth before calmly passing to Bartlett on the left, who easily hit the open side of the cage. With the score tied at 1, Baluik took a lead pass from Bartlett and scored a shorthanded goal to give the Reds a 2-1 lead. The B-line extended the lead to 3-0 later in the third period on another breakaway when Brillant drilled home a 20-footer with assists from Stan and Jimmy. On January 14th, the slumping Reds played the first-place Quebec Aces. In the first period, Bartlett opened the scoring with an assist from Brillant. The game got violent in the second period, though. In the period's first 2 minutes, Bartlett flattened Quebec defenseman Frank Martin, who was then out for the remainder of the game. Later in the period, Bartlett knocked winger Wayne Freitag flat, but unlike Martin, he was able to eventually return to the game after making repairs. The fans started to go nuts, and they began tossing peanuts, rubber footwear, and programs on the ice, and started getting physical with the players along the boards, who began then to mix it up with the spectators. Near the end of the period, both benches cleared, and the teams engaged in a near free-for-all, with 13 penalties called and 3 majors issued. With the score tied 1-1, Stan Baluik thought he scored the game winner at the 3-minute mark of the third period. But with only 5 minutes left of the game, Quebec scored 2 quick goals to steal the win, 3-2, over the Reds. It was Providence's 11th loss in 14 games and had dropped the team all the way from first place to 4th place in the standings. On February 7, 1964, the Reds defeated Rochester 5-1 at the Auditorium. With 85 seconds left in the game, Ed Mazur and Rochester's Don Cherry engaged in a wild stick-swinging duel at center ice. This caused both benches to clear and both teams engaged in a free-for-all as the rink became, according to the Providence Journal, a veritable battle pit. As a result, 10 players from each team were assessed fines. Jimmy scored a goal in the game after he deflected a shot off of Amherst's defenseman Arnie Brown, beating their Hall of Fame goalie Jerry Cheevers. Nobody in a million years could have predicted at the time that within less than 90 days after the sounds of gunshots in Dallas drove the nation into collective despair, that it would be the sound of Ringo Starr's rim shots that would help restore hope and awaken the country from its nightmare. Americans desperately needed their hands to be held, so they gladly accepted the Beatles' offer. On February 9, 1964, when a record 73 million viewers tuned in to watch their first performance on The Ed Sullivan Show. Nobody knew at that moment that these four young lads from Liverpool, who drove the young girls wild with their funny accents while shaking their ridiculous mop tops, would radically lead a cultural revolution, affecting music, fashion, film, art, and politics. But the Fab Four's boundless youthful energy and extraordinary talent had the remarkable ability to reignite our nation's spirit of hope, which had been tragically snuffed out on that fateful November day. With the Beatles leading the parade, the youth culture of the baby boomers began to transform and dominate American culture in the 1960s, challenging and rejecting the mainstream conservative values and norms of more outdated heroes like John Wayne and Douglas MacArthur. Young people were rejecting materialism, advocating for peace, love, and nonviolence, demanding greater personal freedom and individual expression while supporting civil rights and women's liberation. For the rest of Rhode Island's season, the Beatles would hold the number one spot at the top of the charts. On February 12th, the Reds defeated Hershey 3-1 for their fifth consecutive win. The B line was responsible for two of the team's goals. In the third period, Bartlett scored the winning goal on the power play after Baluik made a nifty play. Bartlett then returned the favor near the end of the game by setting up Baluik for the team's third goal after feeding him a beautiful pass. While playing against the Springfield Indians, George Ranieri was severely injured when he was involved in a collision that caused the back of his head to hit the ice with full force. For 3 weeks, George was in intensive care and required surgery to remove a massive clot from his brain. Fortunately for George, he was able to eventually make a recovery and return to the team the following season. On February 25, 1964, Cassius Clay shocked the world when he knocked out Sonny Liston for the World Heavyweight Championship. 10 days later, the new champion announced that he had joined the Nation of Islam and had changed his name to one that would become the most famous name in the history of sports, Muhammad Ali. Prior to Ali, athletes were supposed to be boring, modest, clean-cut, unassuming, and non-controversial. But the Louisville Lip was not going to conform to the public's expectations. Instead, Ali was outspoken, cocky, charismatic, and colorful. Although originally hated by much of mainstream America, as the nation's values and attitudes evolved during the 1960s, Ali's refusal to compromise his values and his willingness to sacrifice his boxing career for his principles eventually transformed him into a beloved, heroic icon. I wonder if hockey ever had any outspoken, cocky, charismatic, and controversial players. On March 6, Jimmy scored 2 goals against the Buffalo Bisons in the Reds' 5-4 victory, which was the Reds' 9th consecutive home win and enabled them to move into a tie for third place in the Eastern Division. On March 7th, the Reds beat the Indians 4-3 on the road in Springfield. It was the first time the team won on the road in Springfield since January 1961. Willie Marshall scored the winner in overtime. Prior to the winning goal, all of Providence's scoring was the result of Brillant's hat trick, with Bartlett setting the table on all 3 of his goals. Because of Ranieri's serious brain injury, on March 17, 1964, the team decided to conduct an experiment and tested out a type of hockey equipment that was very rarely used at that time. After volunteering to be test subjects, hockey helmets were issued to Baluik, Boudreault, and Jimmy Bartlett. After trying it out in practice that day, Jimmy gave his new helmet a surprising endorsement. Bartlett told the press that the helmet was light and after a time you don't even know you're wearing it. I think it's pretty practical considering the protection it gives you. For the rest of the season, Jimmy wore the helmet. However, the following year, he would once again play helmetless and refuse to wear a helmet ever again for the rest of his professional career. It was Bartlett's opinion that before the use of helmets, players did not headhunt as recklessly as they would do after the league-mandated helmet use, and that by providing players a false sense of safety actually contributed to more serious injuries in the long run. During most of Jimmy's hockey career, he was a show-off who loved to grab the spotlight, so each season he would typically have more goals and assists. I used to ask him why he never passed the puck and would jokingly accuse him of being a puck hog. He explained that the reason he didn't get many assists was because normally he was assigned to a makeshift or defensive-oriented checking line, and that his line mates simply weren't that good at scoring goals. However, once Fernie established the famous B line, Jimmy enjoyed a surge in assists. And instead of spending as much time in the penalty box willing to fight anyone and everyone at the drop of a hat, Bartlett developed into a more complete player, as a playmaker as well as being a goal scorer and fighter. In a rare display of modesty, Jimmy showered credit on his new line mates Stan Baluik and Pierre Brillant.
These two guys are the best in the business, and they make playing the game easy. I'd say this is the best line I've ever played on.
When he was asking if he was contemplating retirement since he was now in his 30s, Jimmy quipped back,
"Heck, I'm just learning the game. You don't expect me to quit now, do you?"
At the end of the season, Willie Marshall was the team's leader in scoring, followed by the B-line triplets. The Reds were able to hold on to third place and secure a spot in the playoffs, where they were matched up once again against their playoff nemesis, the Hershey Bears. Rhode Island had not won a playoff series against the Bears since they defeated them in the finals in 1949. However, the team thought that this season would be different because superstar Willie Marshall would be playing against Hershey instead of for Hershey. But despite losing Marshall, the Bears were still loaded with talent. The Bears' leading scorer was their Hall of Fame center, Mike Nikolic. Mike was originally owned by Toronto, but after having only 4 points in 31 games for the Leafs in 1956, he never played another game in the NHL, but was assigned to Rochester until 1958, when he was then traded to the Hershey Bears for Willie Marshall. Nikolic would play the next 14 seasons with the Hershey Bears and would retire as the team's all-time leading scorer. Nikolic would lead the Bears to 2 Calder Cups and in 1967 was named the league's most valuable player. Although he never scored 20 goals in a year, he was considered to be one of the best playmakers in league history, twice leading the AHL in assists. After retiring, Nikolic would become the first full-time assistant coach in hockey history, where he won 2 Stanley Cups with the Philadelphia Broad Street Bullies before becoming head coach of the Toronto Maple Leafs for 4 seasons during the 1980s. Playing in his first season with Hershey was 27-year-old two-way defenseman Ralph Keller. After playing most of his career as property of the Rangers, playing mostly in the Western League with a few stints in Providence and Baltimore, Ralph was poached in the draft by the Montreal Canadiens, who then traded him to the Hershey Bears, where he would play for the next 11 seasons. In 1969, Keller was named first-team All-Star when he helped lead the team to the Calder Cup championship. In his final season with the Bears, team captain Keller scored the game-winning goal that clinched the 1974 Calder Cup championship for Hershey. At the time, the future Hall of Famer retired. He was the league's all-time leading defenseman in career goals. In Game 1 of the series, Hershey crushed the Reds 6-1. Bartlett ruined Ed Chadwick's shutout when he scored Rhode Island's only goal from the edge of the crease off of Bob Blackburn's rebound with only 7 seconds left of the game. Helen Bartlett and the Reds' other hockey wives attended Game 2 of the series at the auditorium. The presence of the team's better halves at the game proved to be inspiring. After Hershey scored in the game's first 2 minutes, Bartlett knocked in the tie-in goal minutes later, awakening the team's sleeping offense, which finally exploded to humiliate the Hershey Bears 11-3, with 8 different Reds finding the back of the net. On April 4, 1964, the team squared off in a hard-fought, evenly played rubber match. With the score deadlocked at 2 after the first period, goalies Chadwick and Giacomin put on a hell of a show, making one terrific save after another to prevent either team from taking the lead. However, at 12:17 of the third period, Nicoluk won the faceoff and dropped the puck back to Ralph Keller, who scored on a 50-foot fluke goal that somehow ricocheted over Giacomin's shoulder after deflecting off of some random player's stick. So to the great disappointment of their loyal Providence fans, even after acquiring the great Willie Marshall, the Reds were once again eliminated by their hated nemesis, the Hershey Bears. The heartbreaking playoff loss was even more devastating to the Reds players than it was to the fans, and the solid team that Fernie Flamin put together began to unravel. Sick of the physical toll it put on his body, Stan Baluik, the heart and soul of the B-line, had had enough. So a few days shy of his 29th birthday, he announced his retirement from hockey, when he was hired to become the club pro at the Kirkbrae Country Club in Lincoln, Rhode Island, a position he would hold for the next 40 years. As a professional golfer, Stan would win the 65 Vermont Open, the 71 Rhode Island Open, the New England Pro-Am, and play in 2 PGA championships. In 1995, he was named Professional Golfer of the Year by the New England PGA, and in 2005 was inducted into the Rhode Island Golf Hall of Fame. 2 days later, Zellio also made his retirement official when he was hired to become the head coach of the Providence College Friars, a position he would hold for the next 4 seasons. Scrappy defenseman Matt Ravlich would be traded to the Blackhawks and would eventually play 410 games in the NHL with Chicago, Detroit, and Los Angeles. Larry Leach was sold to Portland in the Western League. Bob Beckett and Steve Krafchick both retired in the offseason. And Eddie Mazur signed as a free agent with the Victoria Maple Leafs in the Western League, where he played for 1 season before also retiring. The Reds also added 3 defensemen to the team for the upcoming season. Butch Barber, who was a 21-year-old rookie defenseman in his first year out of juniors, Roger Lafreniere, who had come from the Red Wings organization, and tough guy Larry McNabb, who had played for San Francisco in the Western League for 2 seasons before coming to the Reds. Don Cherry joked that McNabb once hit him so hard he couldn't comb his hair for a month. The team also added new forwards. Len Ronson came to the Reds after floating around for a few years in the Red Wings and Canadiens organizations. After playing 1 year in Providence, Len would find great success in the Western League, where he would star for 8 seasons, scoring 51 goals for the 1969 San Diego Gulls as a teammate of Willie O'Ree. At forward, the Reds added the 25-year-old Bruins prospect, Jeannot Gilbert, who had scored 50 goals with Minneapolis and was named MVP of the Central Professional Hockey League the previous season. In his only season with the Reds, Gilbert would score 25 goals. Unfortunately for the Reds, at the end of the season, the Bruins would terminate their AHL affiliation with Rhode Island and would move Gilbert to their new affiliate, the Hershey Bears, where he would star for 8 seasons, scoring 20 goals 7 times. In 1968, Gilbert would lead the Bears to the Calder Cup Championship as the league's leading scorer. In 1973, Gilbert would jump to the World Hockey Association, where he would play 2 final seasons as a member of the Quebec Nordiques. To this day, Gilbert remains the Hershey Bears' 4th all-time leading scorer. On September 17, 1964, ABC debuted their smash new series about a witch who marries a mortal man and vows to lead the life of a typical suburban housewife. The show was called Bewitched and starred the beautiful Elizabeth Montgomery as Samantha and hockey player Jimmy Bartlett as her husband Darren. Actually, Darren was played by Bartlett's doppelganger, actor Dick York. When he was with the Reds, Bartlett was always being asked, "Did anyone ever tell you you look like the husband on Bewitched?" On October 5, 1964, the Rhode Island Reds played an exhibition game against the world champion Montreal Canadiens. After the Habs scored 2 goals in the first period, the Reds were able to fight back to tie the game in the second before the Canadiens were able to open up the floodgates as they easily cruised to a 7-2 win. The game must have felt a bit bittersweet to Bartlett, since Jimmy played against Beliveau, Hodge, Talbot, and the Pocket Rocket when they were all still amateurs, a bunch of teenagers playing junior hockey in the Quebec Hockey League. In the first game of the new season, with the score tied at 2, Jimmy made a nice move around defenseman Warren Godfrey in front of the Pittsburgh cage, and while off balance and reaching, was able to poke the puck into the right corner of the net for the game winner against the Pittsburgh Hornets. George Ranieri also scored a goal in the first game that he played after his near-fatal head injury. On November 15th, the Reds defeated the Quebec Aces 4-2. Len Ronson and Jimmy Bartlett were responsible for all the team's goals, each scoring a pair. Because of the retirement of Baluik, Fernie spent much of the season shuffling around the lines, struggling to recreate the magic and chemistry of the B line. In December, when the flu bug had devastated the team, Fernie decided to put Jeannot Gilbert on a line with Bartlett and Brillant, and the remnants of the former B line were now being called by the press the French line. Even though Bartlett was as French as Queen Elizabeth, I guess because he was from Montreal, that was close enough. Jimmy used to get a kick out of the fact that people often wrongly assumed he was French, so he would sometimes Frenchify his name by calling himself Jim Bartlett. He even taught us kids a jingle that he wrote about himself that we used to sing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, Jim Bartlett, Jim Bartlett. On December 20th, Brillant scored twice and Bartlett had a goal and 2 assists as the newly formed French line scored all of Rhode Island's goals in the team's 4-2 win over the Quebec Aces. During the season, when Jimmy was briefly sidelined with a minor injury, he was interviewed in between periods during a broadcast by the voice of the Rhode Island Reds, George Patrick Duffy. During the interview, Jimmy proudly announced that, "I'm a father again. One of my dogs just had 11 puppies. Do you know of anyone who wants one?" A 12-year-old Reds fan named Jimmy Murray was listening to the game and wrote a letter to Jimmy saying that he would love to have one. He was absolutely thrilled when he received the telephone call from Bartlett telling him that he would give him one of his puppies. After meeting the boy and his family, who he had invited to attend Providence's next game, Bartlett personally delivered one of the puppies to its new adopted family. During the 1960s, attitudes promoting sexual liberation and engaging in casual sex were celebrated by many progressives and by youth culture as a means of rebellion. During the sexual revolution, publisher and cultural icon Hugh Hefner certainly saw himself as a feminist hero, supporting freedom of expression, reproductive rights, equal pay for women, and empowering women by encouraging them to control and celebrate their sexuality without shame or puritanical judgment. However, in retrospect, most now agree that Playboy actually undermined the feminist movement by greatly objectifying women. Now, Playboy promoted the male fantasy of a promiscuous, hedonistic Don Draper-type lifestyle, in contrast to the old-fashioned, sterile, father-knows-best way of life of the 1950s. Nobody exemplified this more than Bond, James Bond. On December 22, 1964, 007 became an international sensation when the smash hit Goldfinger opened. Not only was Bond licensed to kill, he was sexually liberated, completely free of the restraints of polite society, licensed to pursue pussy galore. Being a professional athlete had its disadvantages. Players were considered to be chattel and could be traded away at any time, separating them from their families. And life living out of a suitcase, playing on the road, far from home during the cold days of winter, could take its toll. Many players took solace in alcohol, and the stories of too many of Jimmy's teammates had their lives destroyed by alcoholism. Jimmy was never a boozer. He would have a few beers, but generally stayed away from hard liquor. He never tried to prove his manhood by throwing down shots. He preferred just drinking pina coladas. No, Bartlett's vice wasn't booze, it was women. When Jimmy was growing up in Verdun, he always was the leader of the pack, the oldest boy with a group of followers. During most of his hockey career, Jimmy was older than the majority of his teammates and was sort of like Peter Pan leading the Lost Boys. Even after Jimmy retired from hockey, he always felt more comfortable with younger people than people his own age. Bartlett loved to hold court and engage in locker room guy talk, telling colorful tales of his various sexual exploits to the amusement of the younger crowd. Now, I'm not spilling any embarrassing personal family secrets here. Jimmy was proud as hell of his antics and openly bragged about them, and these are the stories that I heard him tell many, many times. Bartlett claimed that when he played on the road, he usually knew a girl in various cities that he could hook up with and who would then find dates for his friends. According to Bartlett, all professional hockey players cheated on their wives. I would try to correct him and say, "You mean most hockey players? I'm sure there were some players who remained faithful." He would just shake his head, shrug his shoulders, and say, "Nope, all of them." Now, I'm sure that he was exaggerating, but the percentage of players who actually cheated on their wives was probably a lot higher than the players' wives or the public would care to admit. The power of peer pressure is enormous in sports, especially since individuality is discouraged and players are constantly being told to think and act as a team. Now, I don't think that Bartlett claimed everyone was doing it in order to justify his own behavior. And that's because he never felt the need to justify his behavior. He never expressed any guilt, shame, or remorse for his lack of fidelity to Helen. In the movie Goodfellas, the mobsters all had their wives, but they all had their gumas on the side. The mafia is a very exclusive clique of men whose membership entitles them to break society's laws and rules whenever they want. And what's a more exclusive club than being a professional athlete? Like movie stars and rock stars, why shouldn't Bartlett be able to enjoy the fringe benefits of being a celebrity? It was the swinging 60s. It was shagadelic, baby. Now, Bartlett wasn't a misogynist or mistreater or abuser of women. He was the opposite. He was the ultimate charmer. He didn't chase women as much as they chased him. He used to brag about the time he was contacted by a representative of a famous Hollywood actress who tried to arrange a date with him when he was with the Rangers. He bragged about how he had a fling with the wife of a Hall of Fame baseball pitcher. He joked about how he was always getting in trouble for breaking curfew, and the time he once had to run across Niagara Falls in the pouring down rain in order to avoid missing the team bus. He would vividly describe his first encounter with this one girl with enormous boobs by pantomiming how she would lie down on her back, and then how he would remove her bra, and then, "Hey, where the hell they go?" He would then act out how her floppy boobs fell under her armpits, and then quickly raise his arms straight up in the air. "There they are." Jimmy would tell stories of his days on the road the way veterans would tell old war stories. I have no idea which team Jimmy was playing for during any of these stories or who any of his teammates were in these stories. They could have happened at any time during his long career. But he definitely turned vulgar storytelling into a comedy art form, cracking everybody up with his many anecdotes, which often found humor in the darkest of places. Very dark and inappropriate places. "Hey, Jimmy, tell him about Shaky Pete."
So there's this one broad on the road who was really fucking wild, and she just loved to have sex with hockey players. When we get to town, I'd be with her first, and then my buddies would go next. And then we'd go out drinking at the bars or whatever, while the rest of the team would be sitting in the room next to hers, playing cards, waiting for their turn. So anyway, it's late when we get back to the hotel, and some of the other guys are still fucking waiting in line. Anyway, as soon as we get back, this one guy bursts out of her room, and he's got this big-ass smile on his face. He's strutting around, and he starts bragging about how she's the greatest fucking lady he ever had. He's like, when she came, it was totally fucking nuts. Her whole body started shaking, and she just wouldn't stop, and she's just going totally fucking wild with her eyes rolling back in her head. It was fucking insane. So this asshole's walking around acting like he's all fucking hot shit. Well, it turns out that the girl had epilepsy, and she was just having a fucking seizure. After that, of course, we all just gave him the fucking business. And that's why we called her Shaky Pete.
Everybody thought Bartlett's stories were hilarious, and we used to laugh our asses off at them. However, now that I've gotten older, I've come to realize how many could find them to be offensive and disturbing. When groups of guys are together, toxic masculinity can be contagious and can lead sometimes to tragic consequences, like the My Lai massacre or the murder of George Floyd. Or it can cause a bunch of young guys to temporarily forget that they're yucking it up about how a hockey team pulled a train on a woman until it caused her to have a seizure, which could reasonably be perceived as being more than just a wee bit insensitive by members of the Me Too movement. However, the sexual revolution of the 1960s didn't cause women to suddenly become objectified by men for the first time. That's been going on since time began. And that's because when it comes to sex, our biological lizard brain animal instincts kick in, which causes the deepest and darkest and most twisted regions of our subconscious minds to sexually objectify the opposite sex. No matter how enlightened or politically progressive we may consciously think of ourselves as being. If I were wrong, the fashion and cosmetic industries wouldn't be making hundreds of billions of dollars each year. If anyone ever told Bartlett that they were morally offended about his bragging about committing serial adultery while he was married to Helen, he would probably tell them that he didn't give a shit. In a truly liberated society, a woman can have consensual sex with as many men as she wants to, and it's sexist to label willing participants as victims. Bartlett was never religious and never felt bound by conventional moral standards. He was a libertine on ice skates, a Canadian Don Juan. He believed that we're only young once and we should not waste our youth. When my dad would visit me in college, he used to point out various girls I knew and ask if I was sleeping with them. I would say, "Dad, no, she's just a friend." And he'd be like, "So what? You fuck your friends. Nobody gives a shit in 20 years. Now, I'm not 100% sure what he meant by that, but I think he was trying to say that it's better to do things in life that you may one day regret than to regret never having done them at all. In other words, have fun while you still can, because it's your life and it's not a dress rehearsal. So do whatever you want to do, have a good time, and don't care about what other people think." James Bond was sexually liberated and he was licensed to kill. The other JB, Bartlett, James Bartlett, saw himself as licensed to score, both on and off the ice. I guess it goes along with being number 7. Shortly before Christmas, the Reds acquired the 30-year-old veteran right winger Eddie Kachur in a midseason trade with the Los Angeles Blades. In 1958, Eddie was demoted by the Chicago Blackhawks after not making much of an impact during his few years with the team. Kachur would spend the next 6 years buried in the Blackhawks organization, playing for Buffalo in the AHL and Sault Ste. Marie in the Eastern League before being traded to the LA Blades during the summer offseason. During the next 6 seasons, the stocky winger would become one of the Rhode Island Reds' most popular players, scoring 20 goals in 4 consecutive years. In 1967, Eddie would have a monster season, leading the league with 47 goals, earning him a selection as a first-team All-Star. Eddie would end his career in the early 70s as the player-coach of the Johnstown Jets, the team that inspired the movie Slapshot. On Christmas Day, the fans at the auditorium were not feeling that merry, watching their team begin the third period, trailing the Springfield Indians 3-1. However, Christmas cheer began to fill the arena when newly acquired Kachur scored, cutting the lead to 1, and Eddie MacQueen scored the tying goal with 3 minutes left of the game. But it was truly a Christmas miracle when Jimmy Bartlett scored the game winner 26 seconds later with assists from his 2 French line mates. On February 7, 1965, Bartlett scored the tying goal in the Reds' 3-3 tie against the Baltimore Clippers. Rhode Island's other 2 goals were both scored by Willie Marshall, the second one being the 400th of his career. At that time, only Fred Glover had scored more goals in the AHL. On Valentine's Day, Bartlett set up Brillant on a goal in the game's first 40 seconds and was given a 5-minute major for fighting Murray Hall in the Reds' 3-1 victory against the Pittsburgh Hornets. On February 26, Jimmy scored the game's first 2 goals as the Reds exploded for 5 first-period goals in the team's 7-4 win over the Hershey Bears. 2 days later, Bartlett had a hand in all of his team's goals against the Cleveland Barons. Bartlett assisted on both Brillant and Gilbert's first-period goals and also added a helper on Brillant's second-period goal. Jimmy himself added a third-period goal to help the Reds cruise to a 4-2 lead. However, 2 late third-period goals by the Barons sent the game into overtime. The hockey gods must have been angry at the Reds that night because 38 seconds into overtime, Cleveland rookie Doug Sr. beat Giacomin for the game winner, completing the comeback and to the great disappointment to the faithful hometown Providence fans. The heartbreaking loss destroyed the team's confidence and began a disastrous losing streak as the remainder of the season turned ugly. When Fernie Flamin first became the team's coach in the early 1960s, the Providence Reds were full of optimism, with the famous B-line leading the team to 3 consecutive postseason appearances. But those happy times were over, and this devastating loss to Cleveland would begin a long, dark period in the club's history. On Sunday, March 7, 1965, the Reds lost 6-3 to the Baltimore Clippers for their 5th straight loss. On that same day, America had one of its ugliest moments when about 600 civil rights activists, led by John Lewis, began a march from Selma to Montgomery to protest the denial of voting rights to African Americans. Now known as Bloody Sunday, as they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, these peaceful protesters, including women and children, were brutally beaten and bloodied by racist Alabama law enforcement officers. On the next day, America's first combat troops arrived in Vietnam. More than 50,000 Americans would eventually lose their lives in this horrible war that would tear the country apart. As the 60s became more and more turbulent, the Reds just continued to lose. On March 28, 1965, the Reds played the Buffalo Bisons in the final game of the season. In the third period, Bartlett scored to tie the game 4-4 before the team completely fell apart with a humiliating 10-5 loss at the Auditorium. Even though Jimmy had a 3-point game, the Reds lost their 14th consecutive game and ended the season in last place with easily the worst record in the American Hockey League. For the first time in Jimmy Bartlett's professional career, he finished the season as his team's leading scorer. Willie Marshall finished second. However, after leading the Reds with 33 goals and 83 points the previous season, Willie had a major drop in production, finishing with only 12 goals and 56 points. Because of the team's dead last performance, the Rhode Island Reds cleaned house during the offseason. Fernie Flamin was no longer the coach, but remained as general manager. Shortly after the season was over, classes began at the Rhode Island Amateur Hockey School. Many of the best amateur hockey coaches in the area participated in the month-long curricula, including Lou Cimini, who would coach the LaSalle private school hockey team for more than 30 years, and Alan Suarez, who would later coach Brown University and Roger Williams College. But the head instructor was Professor Jimmy Bartlett. For years, Jimmy had worked with kids and teenagers at summer camps during the off-season and loved every minute of it. 22-year-old Lou Lamoriello, who was one of Bartlett's assistant instructors, was still a kid in high school playing for LaSalle when Jimmy was playing for the Reds during the 1950s. I don't think he was the stick boy, but according to Bartlett, Lou used to hang around the team back then, and Jimmy was his favorite player. After high school, Lou became the star player for Providence College hockey team. After graduating from Providence College in 1963, he became their assistant coach the following season under the Friars' new head coach, Zellio Toppazini. After replacing Topper in 1968, Lou would become the head coach at Providence College for the next 15 seasons. In 1987, Lamoriello would become the general manager of the New Jersey Devils, creating 3 Stanley Cup championship teams before moving on to the Maple Leafs and the Islanders. Lamoriello is the only general manager to ever be named the NHL General Manager of the Year more than once. In 2009, the second all-time winningest manager in NHL hockey history was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. Now that is what you call a hockey school. In the 1950s, the city of Newport, Rhode Island began their world-famous annual folk festivals and jazz festivals. When Jimmy played for the Reds, he would work the festivals each year as a volunteer. On July 25, 1965, one of the most historically significant events in modern music history occurred at the Newport Folk Festival. On that day, folk purists booed Bob Dylan as a sellout when he played his first electric set of his career, including his masterpiece, Like a Rolling Stone. Bartlett was probably in attendance, but even though he used to whistle Stevie Wonder's version of Blowing in the Wind, I am absolutely certain that he had no idea at all who Bob Dylan was. Fernie hired former defenseman Ivan the Terrible Irwin to replace him as the head coach. When he was a player, Irwin never hesitated to drop the gloves and played a few seasons with the Rangers of the 1950s, paired on the blue line with Leapin' Louis Fontinato. In 1956, the strong body checker Irwin was named the second-team All-Star, and in 1957, he was named the first-team All-Star when he was a teammate of Bartlett's in Providence. Ivan finished his career in Buffalo, where he was again named a first-team All-Star defenseman in 1958. The biggest move the team made was the massive trade of Eddie Giacomin to the New York Rangers for 3 players. The Reds received versatile left winger Jim Mickle, who had scored 20 goals 3 times for the Cleveland Barons. The team also reacquired old friends Aldo Guidolin and Marcel Paillet. The team's new starting goalie, Paillet, had previously played with Bartlett in Matane, New York, and Springfield, and with the Reds during the '57 season. After returning to Rhode Island, Paillet would become the team's starting goalie for the next 7 years. Aldo Guidolin also returned to the team that he had played for from 1955 until 1958. After leaving the Reds, Aldo spent the year with Springfield, 3 years in Cleveland, and 3 years as the player coach of the Baltimore Clippers before being traded back to the Reds. Meanwhile, Eddie Giacomin would develop into an NHL superstar and become one of the most popular players to ever play for the New York Rangers. Beginning in 1967, Eddie would be named either a first or second team NHL All-Star for 5 consecutive seasons, with him winning the Vezina Trophy in 1971. In 1987, Giacomin would be inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. Although Len Ronson and Jeannot Gilbert tied for the team's leading goals, with each scoring 25 the previous year, Len Ronson was sent to the Portland Buckaroos of the Western League, while the successful French line was broken up with Gilbert heading to Hershey. Although he was able to score 18 goals after coming back from his near-fatal head injury, George Ranieri finally followed his doctor's advice and retired from hockey when he received a nice offer to sell beer for the Molson Brewing Company. Larry McNabb was sent back to San Francisco, and Jill Moffitt retired. And the versatile Eddie MacQueen was sent to the Baltimore Clippers, where he would play 6 more seasons. After losing the final 14 games of the previous season, the Rhode Island fans were anxious that the losing streak would continue into the new year. In the season opener, after Rochester scored the first goal of the game, Leduc tied it up with assists from Bartlett and Brillant. With the game deadlocked at 2 after the final period, newly acquired left winger Wayne Larkin scored the sudden death overtime winner to end the long losing streak. After playing only 39 games, Larkin would be sent to the Vancouver Canucks in the Western League. 3 years later, on the first day of practice of the New York Rangers training camp, Larkin would die while on the ice of a massive coronary thrombosis. He was only 29. The Reds would win each of their first 3 games in overtime to begin the year, and the fans were optimistic that the team would do much better than the previous season. On November 26th, the Reds traded away the versatile Eddie MacQueen to the Baltimore Clippers, where he would play 6 more seasons. In exchange, Providence received the veteran center Dave Creighton, who was one of the only players in hockey history to play more than 600 games in both the NHL and the AHL. From 1948 to 57, Dave had a nice career in the NHL, scoring 20 goals 3 times and playing in 5 All-Star games. However, after playing 3 years for the Rangers, Creighton was poached by the Montreal Canadiens before the 1958 season in the intra-league draft. This move was very fortunate for Jimmy Bartlett, who was promoted by the Rangers to fill the vacant roster spot. At the time, the New York fans were furious and blamed coach Phil Watson for the loss of the popular Creighton. However, Phil claimed that the decision to expose Creighton to the draft was not his, but came from upper management, just like he told Bartlett when the Bruins no longer wanted him. The move by the Canadiens was pretty sleazy. The Canadiens never intended to play Creighton. They just wanted to hurt the Rangers by stealing one of their better players. They had no problem ruining careers by drafting quality players with the intent of burying them in the minors. Between 1959 and 1965, Dave played for the Rochester Amerks, Buffalo Bisons, and Baltimore Clippers, scoring 20 goals 5 times. Creighton would play the 4 remaining years of his career with the Reds. In 1966, Dave would replace Ivan Irwin and become the player coach of the Reds. In 1968, Creighton would be named the league's most valuable player, and after scoring 692 points in 800 games, would eventually be inducted into the AHL Hall of Fame. After he retired, Dave would open up a golf course in Tampa. The last time my dad ever played golf was when Creighton treated me, my dad, and goalie Jill Boisvert to a free round of golf at his club in the mid-1990s. For a while, Coach Irwin experimented with a new line with Creighton centering Bartlett and Kachur. However, Jimmy was replaced on that line eventually with Leduc. Coach Irwin then created a new B line with Serge Boudreault joining Pierre and Jimmy. However, no matter what the coach tried, the team was just as bad as the year before. And unlike the previous season, in which Bartlett led the team in scoring, Jimmy would have the worst season in his professional career, with 45 points, with only 19 goals, scoring less than 20 goals for the first time in his AHL career. But it wasn't just Bartlett who had a subpar year. Creighton would lead the team in scoring with only 53 points and 16 goals. And Willie Marshall would have an even worse year than Bartlett, finishing with only 40 points and just 13 goals. And banged up Pierre Brillant would find the back of the net, scoring only 7 times in 45 games. Although the Providence fans had to suffer through another horrific season, the team was still occasionally capable of thrilling the hometown fans with an exciting action-packed game. On March 20th, 1966, the Reds were trailing the Hershey Bears 4-1 in the third period, with Jimmy scoring the team's only goal. But then the new B line caught fire. Bartlett set up Serge Boudreaux's goal, cutting the lead to 2, and then Brillant tipped in a rebound off of a blistering Guidolin slap shot. While still needing a goal to tie the game, Bartlett made a short pass to Brillant, who somehow was able to miraculously score despite a fierce collision with the goaltender, Claude Dufour, who had ventured far outside of the crease. Finally, at 5:33 of the sudden death overtime period, Bob Leduc was able to score the overtime winner, completing the Reds' dramatic comeback. Unfortunately, the team's losses still greatly outnumbered the team's wins. After losing their 7th straight game, only about 1,000 of Rhode Island's most loyal fans were in attendance on April 6 to witness the team's 4-2 win over the Rochester Amerks. In the first period, Guidolin knocked in Bartlett's rebound for the game-opening goal. Later in the period, Jimmy, taking a nifty pass from Dave Creighton, scored on the breakaway after deking goalie Bob Perreault. After Rochester scored twice in the third period to tie the score, Jimmy assisted on newly acquired center Bob Cable's freakish game winner, which was fired from behind the net and then bounced off the goalie's back into the net. Jimmy then added his 4th point of the night 4 minutes later when he shot a 20-footer that hit the right post and then bounced off Perreault's skate into the net. After getting shut out by Springfield in their next game 4-0, at least Rhode Island finished the season on a positive note when Reds defenseman Keith Walsh scored in overtime his only goal of the season to give the Reds a 6-5 victory over the Quebec Aces in the final game of the season. Jimmy had a miserable season both on the ice and off the ice. His marriage to Helen was over. They were separated and were beginning the process of getting divorced. I don't know if Helen ever knew about Bartlett's philandering ways or whether that contributed to the end of the marriage, but I do know that he held a resentment towards Helen his entire life. According to Jimmy, when the cat was away, the mice did play, and that when he would be out playing on the road, instead of being responsible and paying the household bills, Helen would instead have herself a good old time, blowing money like crazy and running up debt, doing God knows what for fun. As a result, the Bartletts would lose their house to foreclosure, and Jimmy was forced to file bankruptcy. Once, while he was on the road, she got pissed off at him and threw out the majority of his trophies and most of his scrapbooks and photos from his days playing in Boston and Providence. The truth is that they both were just too young and immature, and they never should have ever gotten married. During the summer offseason, Bartlett hit a grand slam in the championship game, leading his fast-pitch softball team to victory in the New England Invitational Fast-Pitch Softball Tournament Championship. Meanwhile, Baltimore Clippers general manager Terry Reardon spent 2 months during the summer negotiating with the Reds for a return to the team of Rhode Island's veteran defenseman Aldo Guidolin. When Baltimore joined the league in 1962, Aldo was not only the team's star defenseman for the next 3 years, he was also the team's coach, and the Clippers desperately wanted him back. The Clippers were offering forwards Ed Lawson and Mike Corbett, but the Reds also demanded the 24-year-old defenseman Ken Stevenson. Despite being reluctant to depart with the young prospect, Terry was able to persuade the Reds to throw in a couple of over-the-hill forwards to complete the trade. Lawson would only score 11 goals for the Reds, and Corbett would only play 5 games. And Ken Stevenson would score only 6 goals as a Red before returning to amateur hockey for the next 5 years. And to obtain Stevenson, who else were the Clippers able to pry away from Providence? Just a couple of 34-year-old forwards who were thought to be washed up and way past their prime. The great Willie Marshall and the fan favorite Jimmy Bartlett. The June 23, 1966 trade to the Baltimore Clippers would be the only time in Jimmy's hockey career that he would ever be traded. This trade marked an end of an era in Rhode Island hockey. During their time playing with the Reds, Stan Baluik, Pierre Brillant, and Jimmy Bartlett combined for an amazing 489 goals. In the long history of Rhode Island hockey, Bartlett still remains third all-time with 200 goals, trailing only Zellio Toppazini and Paul Larivee. And of course, no player in the history of the Reds has spent more time in the penalty box than Jimmy Bartlett. On August 5, 1966, the Beatles released one of the greatest rock albums of all time, Revolver. On the song, Gotta Get You Into My Life, Bartlett used to joke that when Paul would sing, "Ooh, then I suddenly see you, ooh, did I tell you I need you?" that he sounded like he was getting goosed by Ringo with his drumstick. When Jimmy was originally sold to the Providence Reds in 1961, he was happy to be returning to the town that he had made his home. He asked to be sold to Providence instead of being exposed in the interleague draft because he did not want to spend each winter hockey season far away from his kids. And for 5 years, Jimmy was able to enjoy the stability of playing for the Reds while living with his family in Seekonk. But now that his marriage was over and the team no longer wanted him, Jimmy had no choice. If he wanted to continue to play professional hockey, he had to leave his kids Melinda and JJ with Helen in Rhode Island and report to the Baltimore Clippers. They owned him now. The hopeful optimism that began in the 1960s was over. Instead, by the middle of the decade, the 60s would develop into one of the most turbulent and transformative eras in modern history. The last song on Revolver was a psychedelic experimental song by John Lennon that encouraged people to turn off their minds, relax, and float downstream. That was the only option that Bartlett had available. He could either try to resist the changes that were transforming all aspects of society, or he could just go with the flow and try to make the best of it. Maybe it was time to move on. Perhaps change would be good and things would be better in Baltimore. The future is always uncertain. Even tomorrow never knows.